Imagine a child full of wonder, eyes wide with curiosity, a mind buzzing with questions, and a heart full of dreams. James started life like any other kid, dreaming in colours and asking why to everything. But unlike the picture-perfect childhood you might imagine, James wasn't surrounded by the love and comfort a child needs to grow. No, James' world was darkened by an angry father who came home late, his rage filling the air like a storm, and a mother who slipped away into silence, her presence nothing more than an echo. As a boy, James learned to tiptoe through his house, silent, careful, watching the creaks in the floorboards like they were landmines waiting to explode. At the dinner table, words weren't nourishing, they were weapons, thrown like daggers at one another. And worse yet, no one ever apologized. There was no comforting hug, no, "it'll be okay." Instead, there was denial. A deep, suffocating silence where no one acknowledged the damage. A silence that spoke louder than any argument ever could. What James didn't know, what he couldn't understand as a child, was that this silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Because when no one says, "something's wrong here," when nobody calls out the hurt, it leaves a mark on the soul, a wound that never quite heals. It's not just the trauma that damages a person, it's the denial of it, the pretending it doesn't exist, that slowly eats away at the spirit. As James grew older, something started to shift within him. The world didn't offer him safety or comfort, so he did what most children in his position do. He adapted. The once curious and innocent boy, full of dreams, learned to wear a mask. He became charming, funny, and so incredibly skilled at reading people that it seemed like he could turn into whatever anyone needed him to be. It was like he had a chameleon-like ability to change and fit in, to make people laugh, to be the life of the party, and yet, inside he was empty, hollow, like a room with no furniture, walls still standing, but no life behind them. This is what unprocessed trauma does to a person. It creates a chasm between the true self and the persona that is built to survive. James wasn't born broken, but he became someone else in order to survive. The more he wore that mask, the more he buried his real self, and the more hollow he became. It wasn't that James was pretending to be happy. He was pretending to be anything but himself, because being himself meant confronting the pain, the shame, and the grief that no one ever talked about, the pain that no one ever saw. Carl Jung, a man who studied the human psyche deeply, once said, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents." And James, unknowingly, inherited that tragedy, not just in his genes, but in the silence that ran through his family like a poison. The words never spoken, the emotions never acknowledged, the love never given. The mask James wore was a survival mechanism, but as he got older, it began to suffocate him. The more he tried to live up to the expectations placed on him, the further away he got from who he truly was. And while he was out in the world, performing his charm, being the funny guy that everyone loved to be around, at home, in the quiet moments of solitude, something started to unravel. His mind, starved for peace, starved for authenticity, began to crack. But here's the thing, this wasn't some overnight transformation. It wasn't like James woke up one day and decided to wear a mask. No, the mask was slowly stitched together over years, a patchwork of lies, false smiles, and suppressed feelings. It was a coping mechanism, a way to survive the emotional neglect and abuse. But eventually, the very thing that kept him alive would be the thing that would destroy him. The mask started to crack, and the man behind it, the man who had been hidden for so long, began to scream for attention. That's what trauma does. It doesn't disappear, it just waits. It waits until the weight of pretending becomes too much to bear, until the mind can no longer function in the silence of its own wounds. And one day, the mask can no longer hold the weight of the soul that's behind it. For James, the early signs of unraveling were subtle at first. It didn't look like madness in the traditional sense. Instead, it looked like something worse, something that gnawed away at his peace every single day. Insomnia crept in, making every night feel like an endless loop of restless thoughts. It wasn't just that he couldn't sleep, it was the sense that something was always off, like a feeling that there was a storm cloud inside of him, one that he couldn't quite pinpoint, but that he knew was always there. The stillness of the world around him only made his inner turbulence worse. This constant undercurrent of unease became the soundtrack of his life. On the surface, he seemed fine. He smiled, cracked jokes, carried on with daily tasks, but deep down, he was on edge. His nervous system, battered by years of emotional neglect, was constantly in fight or flight mode, even when there was no threat in sight. The trauma was like a wound that never fully healed, a scar that never stopped itching. But worse than the physical toll it took was the toll it took on James's sense of self. The paranoia set in soon after, the belief that everyone was against him, that he was always being watched, judged, or misunderstood. He started to question his own worth, convinced that people didn't really like him or value him, not even those closest to him. Relationships became a battleground. One moment, he'd push people away, terrified of being hurt again. The next, he'd beg them to stay, desperate for any semblance of connection. It was a vicious cycle, and love for him became a war, an endless fight between self-protection and self-sabotage. But this wasn't just about other people, it was about him too. James couldn't trust himself anymore. His thoughts became a maze, and every time he tried to find an exit, it only led to a dead end. He would look in the mirror and not recognize the man staring back. Who was he anymore? Was he really the person people saw, or was he just a hollow shell made of all the masks he had worn over the years? He went to therapy once, trying to explain that he couldn't feel anything, that everything seemed numb, like he was watching life from behind a glass window. The therapist gave him labels, anxiety, depression, but they didn't hit the mark. They didn't explain the deeper wound that was festering beneath the surface. It wasn't just about feeling sad, it wasn't just about anxiety, it was the weight of years of trauma, the constant gaslighting of his own emotions, the denial of his reality. These weren't just symptoms, they were the echoes of a life that had never been allowed to speak its truth. And that's what no one tells you about trauma. It doesn't just go away. It waits, quietly, until you're strong enough to face it, or until it becomes impossible to ignore. James was exhausted, not from life, but from the endless performance. The mask was cracking, and the storm inside him was no longer something he could ignore. It wasn't madness he was experiencing. It was the breaking point of a mind that had been holding it all together for far too long. The tipping point came when James's mind, starved for order and meaning, began to weave its own twisted logic. The voices inside his head, once quiet whispers, grew louder, taking on a life of their own. These were no longer just the random thoughts or fleeting anxieties that came with everyday life. No, these voices were becoming arguments, conversations, and at times full-blown screams. The world around him started to transform into something far more sinister, a hall of mirrors where every detail, every small flicker, every word became imbued with secret meaning. A passing glance from a stranger. It was a message, a fleeting flash of light in a hallway, a sign, the radio ad. That was a direct communication from the universe itself, telling him something important, something he needed to know. What had once been everyday events now seemed to be connected by invisible threads that only James could see, and with every connection, the story deepened. It was here, in this strange world of symbols and illusions, that James began to truly lose his grip on reality. His mind, hungry for meaning, created its own patterns, weaving them into the fabric of his life, until the world was no longer a place of logical cause and effect, but a chaotic web of signs and omens. And even in this chaos, there was no peace, there was no resolution, only the unshakable feeling that something was terribly wrong, even when the world seemed to be carrying on as usual. This isn't madness, James realised. Not really, it was desperation. It was the mind's attempt to impose meaning on a life that had been too painful, too full of loss and confusion to make sense of on its own. The trauma he had buried so deep for so long didn't vanish. It had simply taken on a new form: paranoia. Anxiety had shifted into something far darker, a need to make sense of the madness by creating more of it. But no matter how hard he tried, there was no end to the web of connections his mind created. It was like trying to solve a riddle that only got more complex the more you thought about it. But the cruelest part, James didn't even recognize the real enemy anymore. It wasn't the world, it wasn't the people around him. It was his own mind, turning every question, every doubt, every anxiety into a mountain he couldn't climb. It was the way the mind, desperate to find control, could turn any small thing into a cosmic puzzle, convincing him that there were answers hidden everywhere. But the truth was, those answers didn't exist. They were only the product of a mind that had never been allowed to heal. And so, James found himself caught in this endless loop, one where reality was always just out of reach, and the mind, once a tool for understanding, had become the very thing that kept him trapped. The trauma he thought he had buried was now surfacing in ways he never expected, not as memories, but as hallucinations, as symbols, as fragments of a broken past that refused to stay silent. It wasn't an explosion, but a slow, almost imperceptible crumble. James didn't wake up one day and lose his mind. It had been happening for years, gradually, in the silence of the night, in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. The mask he had worn for so long, the charming, funny, put-together version of himself, began to show signs of wear. It wasn't that James didn't try to hold it together. He did, desperately. Every day was an act of strength, of pretending to be normal, pretending to be someone he wasn't. But beneath the surface, the cracks were spreading, and soon the mask wasn't enough to shield him from the storm inside. James had spent so much of his life shape-shifting, becoming whatever people needed him to be. In public, he was the life of the party, the friend you could count on, the person everyone loved to be around. But all of that was built on a foundation of lies. Lies he told to himself, lies he told to others, and lies he told to keep the world from seeing the truth, that he wasn't okay. The truth was that he had become so skilled at wearing the mask that he had forgotten who he was without it. There were moments, small moments, when he would catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror and not recognize the face staring back at him. It wasn't just about physical appearance, though. It was deeper. It was the way his eyes no longer reflected the hope and curiosity of the child he once was. Instead, they were blank, empty, haunted by the silence of years gone by, the emotional neglect that had shaped him. He tried therapy again, but even then, he couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. He told the therapist that he didn't feel anything anymore, that his dreams were nonsensical, that sometimes he felt like he wasn't even alive. The labels they gave him, depression, anxiety, weren't the problem. They were just convenient tags, easy to slap on a man who had never been allowed to confront the deeper issues. The real problem wasn't a diagnosis. It was the buried trauma that had been festering, unacknowledged, and unseen for all these years. The truth began to surface, not in the way James wanted it to. He didn't wake up one morning and feel free. No, it came in moments of sheer exhaustion. It came when he finally stopped hiding from the pain, when the mask cracked and he allowed himself to feel the things he had been running from. He didn't just start to cry, he started to rage, to scream, to let all of the hurt out, no longer caring who saw it or heard it. Because in those moments, when the mask was gone, there was no pretending anymore. There was only the raw, unfiltered truth of what he had endured, of who he really was underneath the false self he had created. It was like a switch had flipped in James' mind. Suddenly everything became overwhelming, distorted, and impossible to ignore. He wasn't just hearing the usual inner thoughts anymore. Something darker was creeping in. The voices began, at first soft and faint, then growing louder and more insistent. They were not just random thoughts. These were full conversations, arguments, and sometimes screams. The noise was relentless, suffocating. What had once been a quiet, internal dialogue became an unrelenting symphony of chaos. And in that chaos, James tried desperately to make sense of it all. But the more he tried, the more the lines between reality and madness blurred. He walked past mirrors without even blinking, almost as if he didn't recognize the person staring back. The reflection seemed to mock him, showing a face he could no longer trust. He started to carry a notebook, scribbling down thoughts that made no sense. Patterns, symbols, words that felt like they held meaning but, to anyone else, were just incoherent ramblings. The notebook became a lifeline, a way for him to capture the madness swirling inside his head. But it wasn't helping. It was only feeding the confusion. James began to believe that these voices, these patterns, were messages, not metaphorical ones, but literal ones. Every advertisement on the radio, every stranger's glance, every flicker of light in a hallway seemed to carry hidden meanings. He felt as though the universe was speaking directly to him, pointing him in some mysterious direction. To the outside world, James was spiraling, but to him this was the only way to make sense of a life that had never made sense. His mind, starved for order, created its own structure out of the chaos. What he didn't know was that the mind, in its desperation to find order, can sometimes create meaning where none exists. This is the trick of unresolved trauma. It doesn't go away. It doesn't just disappear because you don't want to deal with it. It hides in plain sight, manifesting as anxiety, anger, or, like in James' case, mystical insight. Behind the masks and the so-called wisdom, there was a child screaming for help, for someone to notice the pain he had buried so long ago. But that plea, the real cry for help, was drowned out by the noise inside his head. And by the time James realized it, the world had already turned its back on him. What really hurt was not the madness, but the isolation. The world didn't understand him. They feared him, ridiculed him, and turned his struggles into a spectacle. He had become just another cautionary tale, another statistic to explain away, another what went wrong. But the truth was, James didn't go crazy because he was weak. He went crazy because he was strong for too long. And when the strength ran out, when the mask finally shattered, all that was left was the chaos of his mind, desperately trying to make sense of a lifetime of pain. As James' mind began to unravel, the cracks in his carefully constructed identity started to show. For so long, he had worn the mask, charming, friendly, always adapting to what others needed him to be. But beneath that mask was a truth that he had spent his entire life running from. The facade was no longer enough to hold everything together. The weight of the lies, the denial, and the unspoken trauma was too heavy. Every day, he was playing a part, pretending to be something he wasn't. And then one day, the mask cracked. This was the moment when James' real self, the part of him that had been buried so deep, came rushing to the surface. He didn't just lose control. It wasn't a sudden burst of madness. It was a slow, grinding collapse. His mind, overwhelmed by the endless suppressing of his pain, finally shattered the illusion he had built around himself. He was no longer just James the charming, the funny, the one everyone relied on. Now, he was forced to face the parts of himself he had tried to bury for so long, the parts that were raw, painful, and unsettling. But what he didn't realize was that these fragments of his broken self were not the enemy. They were the truth. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, called this process individuation, the difficult, painful journey toward wholeness that requires facing the dark, chaotic parts of the self. And though it sounds like a noble idea in theory, for James, it felt like drowning. He didn't see the growth. He didn't see the potential for healing. All he felt was the weight of his past crushing him from all sides. In the moments when he was alone, he would sit in the silence of his room and feel it all. Rage, grief, confusion, all swirling together in a tornado of emotions. He didn't know how to stop it. He didn't know how to make it go away. And sometimes it felt easier to ignore it, to push it aside. But the more he did that, the louder it became. Eventually, James realized that ignoring the past didn't kill it. It made it stronger. Unhealed trauma becomes like a ghost, haunting you even when you're trying to move forward. The past doesn't die. It multiplies, silently suffocating every part of you that tries to live. And in those moments, when the walls felt like they were closing in on him, James realized something else. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to escape. He had built this false version of himself to endure the pain, but in doing so, he had lost the connection to the real James. It was the slowest, most agonizing process imaginable, a deep fracture between who he was and who he had to pretend to be. And when the mask shattered, there was nothing left but the raw, exposed truth of who he truly was. The question now was, would he be able to confront it, or would it pull him under for good? As James spiraled further into this inner chaos, he started hearing things. It wasn't just random thoughts or fleeting worries. It was a deep, unshakable voice that felt almost like it was coming from within him. Conversations, arguments, screams, he would hear them loud and clear in his head. At first he chalked it up to stress, to the toll his fractured mind had taken, but soon it became undeniable. These weren't just thoughts, they were messages, they were demands. His mind, starved for clarity, began to see patterns in the world around him, and what was once a vague feeling of unease turned into a deep belief that the universe was talking to him, directly. It wasn't metaphorical, it wasn't a random coincidence. In James' mind, the flicker of a streetlight, the brief glance of a stranger, even the ads on the radio were all signs, messages from the universe, pointing him in some direction he couldn't quite understand. He believed it. The chaos in his life, the trauma that had never been resolved, had distorted his perception to the point where he thought everything around him had meaning. His mind was grasping at straws, trying to make sense of something that, deep down, was never going to make sense. The problem was, the trauma hadn't been dealt with. It had stayed hidden beneath the surface, festering. The more James searched for answers, the more elusive they became. The louder the voices in his head grew. The more he became consumed by them, the further he slipped away from reality. Anxiety, anger, confusion, they all blurred together. But what it all came down to was a simple truth. His soul, crying out for help, was trying to get his attention in any way it could. His trauma didn't want to be ignored anymore. But the world doesn't understand madness. It fears it. It writes it off as irrational, as unstable. And so James became just another example of someone who had snapped. Another statistic, another tragedy. But the truth was, he didn't go crazy because he was weak. He went crazy because he was strong for too long. He held it together, played the part, and smiled through the pain. He endured when he should have let the hurt out. Let it breathe. Let someone, anyone, see it. What the world called madness was simply his mind's desperate attempt to make sense of everything it had been forced to suppress. And no one around him could understand that. They only saw the symptoms, the strange behaviour, the erratic thoughts. They couldn't see the years of silent suffering, the trauma that never had a voice until it came roaring out in the form of voices, patterns and delusions. But deep inside, James knew. He knew it wasn't madness, it was his broken self, finally, painfully, trying to be heard. James had spent years constructing a mask, an identity built on the pieces of a persona he thought he needed to survive. It wasn't real, not in any true sense. It was a facade, a carefully curated version of himself he showed to the world. On the outside, he was charming, funny, the life of the party. He could read people like books, shape-shift into whatever role was needed in the moment. But inside, he was empty. Like a house with beautiful walls, but no warmth, no life, no soul. The trauma had conditioned him to suppress his true self. He learned early on that showing vulnerability, expressing pain, wasn't safe. His father's rage and his mother's silence had taught him that emotions weren't to be shared, that the world didn't have space for his true feelings. So he built this false self, someone who could smile through the pain, someone who could keep the world at bay while his true self was buried deep beneath. But the thing about a false self is that it can only hold up for so long. Eventually, the weight of the mask becomes too much to bear. It cracks. At first, it's just a small crack, barely noticeable. But over time, the fractures spread until the mask can no longer hide the truth. And when that moment comes, when the mask shatters, what's left? What's left is the raw, exposed, vulnerable James, the one he had been running from for so long, the one who had been suffocating beneath the weight of expectations, pretending to be someone he wasn't. And that was the hardest part, because what emerged wasn't pretty. It wasn't the polished, charming James the world knew. It was a shadow of the boy who had been hurt, neglected, and left to fend for himself. All the rage he'd bottled up, all the grief he'd buried, it came rushing to the surface in a violent wave. It wasn't just a breakdown, it was the unravelling of everything he thought he had to be. It was the collapse of the person he had become in an effort to survive. In the aftermath, there was no relief, no calm, just a quiet, suffocating loneliness. James wasn't just lost in the world, he was lost to himself. The person he had shown to others was gone, and the person he had been hiding for so long. His pain, his vulnerability, his brokenness was now staring back at him, and for the first time, he had no choice but to face it. To face the parts of himself that had been hidden for so long, the parts he was too scared to see, too ashamed to acknowledge. But this is where the real struggle began. The false self had been his protection, and now that it was gone, there was nothing left to shield him from the pain. No mask to hide behind. It was just James, raw and exposed, confronting everything he had tried to forget. And for a while, it felt like drowning, like being pulled under by the weight of everything he had ignored. But deep within, something else stirred, a flicker of hope. Because as painful as it was, this was the first step toward healing. The mask had fallen away, and now, for the first time, he had the chance to rebuild himself. This time, without the lies, without the pretending. But first he had to let go of the illusion. Only then could he face the truth of who he really was. James had always feared his mind was slipping away from him, but the truth was, it wasn't madness. It was a message, a cry for help from parts of himself that had been locked away for far too long. When everything finally collapsed, the mask, the false self, the carefully constructed persona, it was as though the world stopped making sense. The chaos, the disjointed thoughts, the wild emotional swings, they weren't signs of a mind unravelling. They were the signs of a soul that had been ignored for too long, a psyche desperate to be heard. He had spent so much time pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't, pretending that he didn't care when the world around him was burning. But pretending doesn't solve the problem, it only buries it deeper. And when the buried pain comes to the surface, it often manifests in ways that feel like madness. The fragmented thoughts, the voices, the disconnection from reality, these were all the byproducts of a lifetime of unacknowledged grief and unresolved trauma. What James had failed to see at first was that this wasn't insanity. It was the soul's protest, a mind breaking down under the weight of too many years of pretending, too many years of silence, too many years of denial. And once he began to look at the chaos, once he began to accept it, he realized something profound. It wasn't about fixing everything at once, it was about listening to the pain, the fear, the parts of himself he had ignored. Because beneath all the madness was a simple truth, the truth of who he was before the world shaped him. before the trauma stole his peace. He wasn't broken, he was buried. And healing, he learned, didn't begin with fixing himself or becoming someone new. It began with returning to the truth of who he had always been. It started with listening to the silence, with acknowledging the parts of himself that had been drowned out by the noise of the world. James didn't need to find answers right away. What he needed was to stop running. He needed to stop pretending. And in that stillness, in that quiet honesty, he found the strength to heal. Because healing doesn't come from avoiding the darkness. It comes from facing it, from understanding that the madness wasn't the enemy. It was the message, a message from the parts of himself that had been waiting for him to listen. And when he finally did, he realized that there was no cure for madness. There was only a return to truth, the truth of who he really was.